Margaret Whitfield dropped to her knees beside the old kitchen table and pulled up the loose floorboard exactly where her dead aunt told her to look. Beneath it sat a rusted tin box hidden for nearly 30 years. Just weeks earlier, a judge had given Margaret's beautiful historic home to her ex-husband. On paper, Daniel Marsh looked innocent. Every deed, every signature, every bank record, perfectly clean. But Aunt Clara never trusted clean paperwork. Inside the box was proof Daniel had been stealing Margaret's life one signature at a time. And to understand why her aunt hid those documents for 27 years, we have to go back to the morning Margaret lost everything. Daniel Marsh stood perfectly still in the doorway of the house that Margaret had built with her own two hands, watching her leave with nothing more than 2 suitcases. There was no apology in his posture, no shame in his steady gaze, just the calm, infuriating face of a man who truly believed that signed paperwork had made him innocent of theft. The porch beneath his expensive shoes was the exact one Margaret had spent 3 weeks sanding by hand. The kitchen behind him held the terracotta tiles she'd chosen on a rainy Tuesday 10 years ago. The garden outside breathed in the spring air only because she had saved it from rot and neglect. But the court had called it his. And so, with a quiet dignity that cost her everything, Margaret walked away. 4 days later, she drove deep into the winding roads of the Great Smoky Mountains, leaving Hendersonville far behind. She pulled up to a small clearing and unlocked a cottage Daniel had never known existed. Aunt Clara's cottage, a sanctuary nestled among towering pines and thick mountain fog. The air smelled sharp, like pine needles and impending rain. Margaret stepped inside, the heavy door creaking softly. The air held the nostalgic scent of old cedar, dried lavender, and settling dust. For the first time since the gavel fell, she let out a breath she felt she'd been holding for years. Margaret walked toward the center of the room. Beneath the old kitchen table was a loose floorboard Aunt Clara had once told her, in a voice thick with unspoken warnings, never to fix. Margaret knelt on the unpolished floor, trembling, and wedged her fingers into the gap. The board groaned, revealing a dark, hollow space. A locked, rusted tin box sat inside, wrapped in oilcloth, having patiently waited for this exact day. Margaret pulled the tin box into the dusty light. The lock gave way with a sharp click. She opened it and finally broke down. The tears came hot and fast. She didn't weep because Daniel had won the house, or because she was starting over at 50 with 2 suitcases. She cried because her aunt had hidden undeniable proof that he never should have won in the first place. Inside the box rested a faded green folder. On the front, in Aunt Clara's looping handwriting, were 7 devastating words: "For the house they may try to take." To understand why that folder shattered Margaret's heart, we have to go back, all the way to the first day she laid eyes on Willowmere Drive. Long before the court called the property Daniel's, long before he changed the brass lock, it was a bitterly wet Thursday afternoon outside Hendersonville. Heavy rain blurred the outline of the neglected house at the end of the street. It was a sad, sagging structure. The wide porch leaned to the left, paint peeled from rotting siding. Overgrown weeds choked the flower beds. Daniel didn't bother turning off the engine. "Margaret," he said, staring through the rain-streaked window with disgust. "This is not a house. This is a bottomless repair bill with windows attached." But Margaret had already stopped hearing the rain and stopped hearing him. The realtor stood on the soggy porch with a folder over her head. "It definitely needs work," she called out. Margaret climbed the rotting steps anyway, ignoring the puddles soaking her shoes, and reached out to touch the tarnished brass doorknob. It was cold, heavy, and solid. "That's not always a bad thing," she whispered, already seeing what it could be. Inside, Daniel saw only liabilities: water stains, warped baseboards, a sinkhole for their savings. Margaret saw the magnificent 10-foot ceilings, the hand-carved original trim, a beautiful historic home starved of love, but not irreparably ruined. She stepped into the kitchen. One cabinet door hung on a single rusted hinge. The floor was dull and scratched, but natural light poured through the bay windows, making the dusty air glow. Margaret stood perfectly still. Some places do not try to impress you. They immediately recognize you. That night, Daniel paced their rental apartment and declared the numbers made no sense. So Margaret waited until he fell asleep, then called Aunt Clara from the kitchen, spreading the inspection report and terrifying repair estimates across the table. Clara listened without interruption. When Margaret finished reading the dismal numbers, her aunt asked one single, piercing question. Did it feel like yours? Margaret closed her eyes. The warm kitchen light, the tulip poplar in the yard, the quiet upstairs room with the perfect view. Yes, she whispered. Then come by my house tomorrow, Clara said, and hung up. The next afternoon, Clara handed her a thick sealed envelope. Inside was a cashier's check for an amount that made Margaret dizzy. Aunt Clara, I can't take this. You can, Clara said. And you will. It is not a loan, she added, before Margaret could protest further. This is a gift strictly to you. Not to Daniel. Not to the marriage. To you. Margaret almost smiled, thinking her aunt was being overly cautious. Clara did not smile back. Keep meticulous records of what you give, baby. Love may feel honest in the moment. Paperwork is not always kind. Then she slid a folded piece of cardstock across the table, written in green ink, for the house that already knows your name. Margaret tucked the note into the second drawer beside the stove in her new kitchen, the same drawer that would be found suspiciously empty 27 years later. In the beginning, Daniel praised her loudly. He watched her turn dull rooms into warm sanctuaries. He beamed when dinner guests asked who had made the old house feel so alive. In those early years, Margaret answered eagerly, about estate sales in Flat Rock, about moving the hydrangeas to save them from afternoon heat. But slowly, the language in the house began to shift. Daniel learned to step into conversations before she could finish her sentences. We worked hard on it, he'd say smoothly. Or, I told Margaret we needed something warmer. Or, that light fixture was part of our design plan. At first she barely noticed. Then she noticed and forgave it. Then she noticed constantly and simply stayed quiet, swallowing her pride for the sake of peace. The breaking point came on a crisp autumn evening. Daniel had invited wealthy real estate clients for dinner. Margaret spent the entire day preparing the house, polishing floors, setting the table with silver, clipping rosemary from her garden, placing candles where the shadows fell too sharply. During dessert, one client leaned back and said, Daniel, this house is exactly the kind of welcoming, luxurious feeling you should be creating in your high-end listings. Daniel smiled his practice smile. Thank you. That's exactly what I've been trying to teach my team. Margaret's hands froze over the silver coffee pot. He hadn't simply accepted a compliment. He had taken a room she'd bled for and turned it into proof of his professional talent. The following week, he brought home photos of a cold, unsold lakeside property. Just help me warm it up a bit, he said, loosening his tie. Margaret stayed up past midnight, rearranging the brochure, rewriting the sterile language, softening the color palettes, creating an emotional story around the house. Daniel presented her work Monday morning. By Friday, he had the client. By the next month, his website read, Creative Property Positioning by Daniel Marsh. Her name was completely absent. When he kissed the top of her head and asked, Looks professional, doesn't it? She desperately wanted to say that was mine. Instead, she said, It looks very good. That sentence became a heavy iron door she willingly closed on herself. More unpaid, uncredited work followed. Listing copy, design boards, client presentations, open house staging, hundreds of handwritten notes crafted in Daniel's voice. Margaret called it a partnership. But a true partnership leaves fingerprints on both sides of the glass. This arrangement only ever left his. Aunt Clara noticed during a visit in late May. The kitchen table was buried under Daniel's client materials. Margaret had been hunched over for hours, trimming photographs. Clara stood in the doorway, studying the pile, then fixed her piercing gaze on her niece. Is your name printed on a single piece of this? Margaret kept her eyes on the scissors. It's for his business, Aunt Clara. That was not my question. Before Margaret could answer, Daniel breezed in, phone to his ear, casually kissed Margaret's cheek without glancing at the work, and flashed a brilliant, empty smile at her aunt. Keeping her busy, he chuckled, covering the phone's mouthpiece. She really likes having something useful to do. Useful. The word landed softly, but hit like a blow. Clara did not argue. She only watched with cold eyes as he left the room. The moment his car pulled out, she reached into her purse and pulled out a heavy old iron key bound with faded green thread. She pressed it firmly into Margaret's palm and folded her fingers over the cold metal. There is a small cottage miles past Elk Park, deep in the woods, Clara said. My name is on the deed. It is the only name Daniel will never think to search for. Margaret asked why she was giving it to her. Clara's stern face finally softened with a heartbreaking pity. Because every woman should have at least one door in this world that absolutely no one else controls. Margaret wanted to laugh it off, but the massive client packet on the table bore no trace of her existence. And for the first time, her aunt's gesture did not feel like an overreaction. It felt terrifyingly necessary. The very first legal paper Daniel asked Margaret to sign looked entirely harmless. It happened on a rainy Tuesday in October. The house smelled of roasted chicken and lemon soap. Daniel strolled into the kitchen with a thick manila folder. "Just some standard refinancing papers," he said. "Nothing serious. It gets us a better interest rate." He flipped the dense pages quickly, pointing with a silver pen. "Sign here. Initial here. Date here." Her pen stopped over a paragraph mentioning a shift in the title structure. "What does this mean?" she asked. Daniel leaned in, his cologne overwhelming the smell of the soap. "That's just standard lender language. The house stays with us. This only keeps things clean for the bank." Clean. Margaret knew that word. In Daniel's world, clean meant streamlined and ultimately controlled by him. She opened her mouth to ask more. But then he let out a small, calculated sigh. Not angry, just profoundly disappointed. The exact kind of sigh that made a woman feel guilty for slowing down the progress of her own life. Pushing her instincts down, Margaret signed. Her name moved across the white page, legally signing away a piece of her safety. After that night, a slow avalanche of legal papers appeared on the kitchen counter over the next decade. Complex incorporation forms, insurance updates, a home equity adjustment tied to his failing ventures, a deed correction he claimed the city should have fixed years ago. Each document came with the same calm voice, the same rushed explanation, and the same quiet pressure to simply trust her husband. With every stroke of her pen, the house felt a little less like hers. 3 months before Aunt Clara's heart gave out, Margaret drove up to Elk Park to visit her. Clara sat near the drafty window, terrifyingly frail, her skin like translucent paper, but her eyes still watching the world like nothing could fool her for long. Margaret chatted nervously about the garden, the weather, a new commercial listing Daniel was proud of. Clara let her talk until she ran out of breath. Then she asked one devastating question. "Has that man put anything in front of you to sign lately?" Margaret went still. The small room felt impossibly tight. She looked down at her lap. "Just a few things. Routine stuff." Clara slowly opened a small battered lockbox beside her rocking chair, pulled out a folded envelope tied with green thread, and placed it in Margaret's trembling hand. "The cottage key is still yours," Clara rasped. "But I fear a key may not be enough to save you." Margaret frowned. "Aunt Clara, what is hidden under the floorboard?" Her aunt's cold hand closed tightly over hers. "Proof. Something Daniel Marsh cannot ever explain away." The thick divorce papers arrived by certified mail on a bright Monday morning. Margaret was outside pruning the hydrangeas, her gardening gloves damp with dew, dark soil under her fingernails. Inside, Daniel stood by the bay window, laughing in the polished fake voice he used when serious money was listening. The mail carrier handed her the envelope and looked away too quickly. Margaret carried it to the kitchen and placed it on the island. Daniel strolled in 15 minutes later, still wearing his headset. He saw the envelope. He saw her face. For one fraction of a second, the ruthless man behind the impeccable manners finally showed. Then the polite mask returned. "I really wanted to sit down and talk about this before that arrived," he lied. "No, Daniel. You arranged for it to arrive while I was outside, so I couldn't ask questions." He didn't bother to answer. He just turned and walked away, and that silence did vastly more damage than any confession could have. In the horrible weeks that followed, Margaret was forced to learn how terrifyingly fast a 30-year marriage could be reduced to bloodless paperwork. Her attorney, Simone Vance, worked from a quiet office near downtown Hendersonville. One rainy afternoon, Simone spread Daniel's mountain of perfectly organized documents across her desk and slowly removed her glasses. "Margaret, some of these signatures gave him vastly more unilateral control over your shared assets than you ever realized. His lawyer is going to argue that his income solely carried the home financially, and these documents back up that narrative." "Simone, I carried that house," Margaret said. I physically carried it. I stayed up nights stripping those walls. I sanded those oak doors until my hands bled. I paid for materials from my own savings. I did unpaid labor helping his business grow for decades. Simone's voice lowered. I absolutely believe you. Then the lawyer looked back down at the pile of legally binding files, and Margaret suddenly understood. In the eyes of the law, a lawyer's belief was not evidence. The final hearing took place on a gray, freezing morning in the Henderson County Courthouse. Daniel arrived in an impeccably tailored navy suit. Margaret wore a simple black dress she'd bought for funerals, never imagining she'd wear it to watch her life be divided. Daniel's attorney spoke first, throwing around heavy phrases: primary sole income, documented mortgage payments, strategic refinance structure, generous settlement. Each polished phrase moved the house farther from Margaret's reach. Simone fought back passionately, speaking about decades of unpaid labor, the design work that increased property value, Margaret's invisible but vital role in building Daniel's business. But the judge kept returning to the stacks of paper. Who signed the deed? Who paid the bank? Who appeared on the county record? When the judge read the final terms, Margaret heard them through a strange buzzing in her ears. Daniel would keep the house, the equity, the business. Margaret would receive a cash settlement barely enough to survive in a cheap apartment for a while, nowhere near enough to replace a stolen life. Afterward, in the marble hallway, Simone gently touched her arm. If we had possessed clearer proof of your original family contribution, this could have gone very differently. Margaret nodded, too exhausted to explain that her aunt had warned her about this exact catastrophe long before any lawyer did. That evening she was back at Willowmere Drive, packing only what the settlement allowed. 2 suitcases, 1 cedar chest, a few photographs, her design sketchbooks. Standing in the darkened kitchen for the very last time, she reached for the second drawer beside the stove, where she'd tucked Aunt Clara's green ink note for decades. The drawer was not rummaged through. It was simply, surgically empty. Daniel had not merely started erasing her at the courthouse today. He had been methodically erasing her for years. After a miserable few nights in a borrowed room at a church friend's house in Fletcher, desperate and crying, Margaret knelt before her aunt's cedar chest. The small iron key was still taped beneath the lid where Clara always kept it. She peeled it loose and opened the lock. Inside, buried under table linens, paper sewing patterns, a family Bible, and old holiday cards, she found a small envelope bound with green thread. On the front, in her aunt's handwriting, were 5 devastating words: when you have nowhere left. Margaret tore it open with shaking hands. Inside was the iron key to the mountain cottage, ice cold and heavier than she remembered, and a hand-drawn map on thick paper. Past Elk Park, beyond the Linville River, turn left where the pavement thins to dirt. 3rd gravel road after the old stone church. And at the bottom, underlined twice in green ink, go before you start believing their terrible version of you. Margaret read the line once. Then again. Outside the window a truck passed in the wet night. And for the first time since the courtroom, something sharp and powerful moved beneath her suffocating grief. It was not quite hope yet, but it was absolute, undeniable direction. By dawn she was back on the road. Past Elk Park, the highway narrowed to a neglected 2-lane road. Barns gave way to rusted wire fences, which gave way to towering pines that swallowed all sound. The tires crunched onto dirt, deep rutted gravel. The car climbed steeply between dark rhododendron and pine, heavy wet branches brushing the windows like claws. Her cell signal vanished. For the first time in weeks, there was no courthouse, no lawyer's office, no Daniel, no brass deadbolt. There was only the rough mountain road, the iron key, and her dead aunt's trembling map. The dense trees finally opened up. The cottage stood silently in a sun-dappled clearing. Weathered cedar siding turned silver with age, a tin roof darkened with rust, a porch railing dangling loose on one side. It didn't look like a piece of real estate. It looked completely, intentionally hidden. And right now, hidden was vastly more valuable than beautiful. The iron lock resisted fiercely, then gave with a loud, satisfying clack. The heavy door swung inward with a tired screech of rusted hinges. Dust motes danced in the sudden shaft of light. One main room, a massive stone fireplace, a narrow iron-framed bed, a woven rocker, rough shelves lined with dusty jars and half-melted candles. And right there, beneath the south-facing window, was Aunt Clara's old kitchen table, plain unvarnished wood, its surface scarred by time. Margaret stepped inside and closed the door behind her, locking out the world. She dropped her suitcases and walked directly to the table. Hundreds of small knife marks near one corner. A burn ring from a coffee cup. A crescent moon scorch in the wood. This was not a beautiful, curated table. It was a deeply used one. A kept one. Margaret sat down and let the profound silence of the mountains settle around her ringing ears. Then her eyes fell to the floorboards beneath the table. Third board from the left. She lowered herself to the cold floor, found the rough edge, and pulled. It lifted far too easily, exactly as if it had been waiting for her specific hand for 30 years. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth, was the heavy locked tin box. She reached for it slowly, because she knew, deep in her bones, that whatever Clara had hidden here, she had not hidden it just to protect the cottage. She had hidden it for the exact day Margaret would come looking for a way to fight back. The tin box opened with a sharp click. Inside was a single green folder, its corners faded soft with age, tied shut with white string. Written on the front cover in her dead aunt's unmistakable handwriting, "For the house they may try to take." Margaret untied the brittle string. The first page was a handwritten letter, the pen stroke still fierce. "My dearest Margaret, if you are reading this, someone has made you feel like the beautiful life you built with your own hands can be legally taken from you because your name was not placed where it rightfully should have been. I knew I could not make you see the truth about Daniel before you were ready. A woman has to wake up to the nightmare in her own time. But while you slept, I could keep proof. I could keep a weapon safe for you for the day your memory alone would not be enough. Memory would not be enough. The exact lesson the judge had just taught her. Behind the letter was a perfectly preserved copy of the cashier's check Clara had given her decades ago. The memo line was unambiguous. Gift to Margaret Whitfield for purchase of primary residence. Separate family contribution. Not to Daniel. Not to the marriage. Exclusively to her. Stacked behind it, official wire transfer records, deposit slips, a signed receipt from the original closing attorney. And then, a legally notarized sworn statement from 27 years earlier, bearing Clara's bold signature and a raised notary seal. The funds provided to my niece, Margaret Whitfield, are exclusively a personal family gift intended solely for her individual contribution toward the purchase, renovation, and protection of the property known as Willowmere Drive. Then the receipts, hundreds of them. Italian tile, raw lumber, paint, custom porch railings, garden drainage systems. Several invoices billed directly to Margaret's maiden name. Others carried her aunt's handwritten notes, paid from Margaret's personal checking. Kitchen restoration materials. Front porch structural repair. All personally purchased by Margaret. Then the photographs. Margaret in ripped jeans beside a stack of reclaimed floorboards. Margaret in the dusty, unfinished kitchen, paint on her wrist, smiling the deep, satisfied smile of a woman happily drowning in hard work. Margaret on her knees in the mud planting the hydrangeas. And in the background of one photo, Aunt Clara stood watching, smiling at the camera like she already knew history would one day need a visual witness. On the back of that photo, in pen, "This is the exact day she began making the dead house live again." Margaret pressed the photo flat on the table, lowered her head onto her arms, and finally, truly broke. She did not cry loudly. She did not cry beautifully. The massive grief she'd carried since the hearing slipped out of her hands and shattered on the floor. She cried because her aunt had fiercely believed her long before there was ever a legal case to fight. She cried because someone brilliant had known that a woman's labor could be stolen twice. First by a manipulative man, then by the cold legal record he carefully controlled. When the tears stopped, Margaret looked at the bottom of the folder. One final page. A long list of 20 names with phone numbers and addresses. Former contractors. A closing assistant from the bank. A neighbor from Willowmere Lane. A retired bookkeeper from Daniel's old real estate office. At the top of the page, in 4 bold words, "People who saw what you did." That single piece of paper changed the gravity of the room. The check proved the money. The receipts proved the labor. The notarized statement proved the legal intent. But the names meant she might not have to stand alone in front of a judge ever again. She reached for her phone. No signal. Of course. She carefully gathered every precious page and held the green folder against her chest. The documents alone didn't hand her Willowmere back today. But for the first time in decades, Margaret possessed something Daniel had never expected her to have. proof with dates, proof with living names. A brilliant witness who had been dead for years but still knew exactly how to speak from the grave. By morning, she'd driven back down just far enough to find 2 weak bars of signal near an old stone church. She called Simone Vance, who answered on the 4th ring, sounding tired. "Margaret? Is everything okay?" "Simone," Margaret said, her voice shaking but loud. "I found something." "What kind of something?" "Proof." That single word changed the silence on the line. Margaret read off every detail: the cashier's check, the bank stamp, the notarized statement's date, the piles of receipts, the photographs, the witness list. When she finished, Simone went quiet for 10 seconds. Then her voice sharpened into a blade. "This does not automatically hand you the keys back today. I know, but it entirely changes the legal conversation we're about to have." Simone gave rapid instructions. "Don't call Daniel. Don't tell anyone connected to Willowmere. Find a copier. Photograph every page. Keep the originals locked. And Margaret, that green folder does not leave your hands for a second." That afternoon, Margaret sat at the copy machine of a tiny office supply store in Elk Park. The young clerk, a girl named Josie with pink hair, handled the fragile pages with extreme care. When she reached the photograph of Margaret in the unfinished kitchen, paint on her wrist, bare cabinets behind her, she paused. "Is this you?" "Yes." "You looked incredibly happy," Josie said softly. Margaret had no answer. She had remembered the grueling work. She had remembered the loss. She had somehow entirely forgotten the happiness. Back at the cottage, she opened a blank notebook. For the first time in 30 years, the columns she drew were not for Daniel's business. They were for her. Name, phone number, what they saw, what records they might still have. The first call went to Ted Satterwhite, a retired carpenter in Old Fort. When Margaret mentioned the Willowmere renovation, the custom porch railing, the kitchen window trim, the tulip poplar, he went quiet. Then, "You're the wife who actually knew the measurements. Your husband talked a lot," he grumbled. "But you were the only one who knew how that house was built." Then he paused. "I remember he asked me to put the final invoice strictly under his name alone. Said it kept things clean for the bank." Margaret wrote one word in her notebook: clean. The same weaponized word Daniel had used on her for decades. Before she could dial the next name, her phone lit up. It was Daniel calling. No one was supposed to know she was doing this. She let it ring. The voicemail pinged. Daniel's smooth voice filled the cottage. "Margaret, I heard you've been calling people about Willowmere Drive. Our settlement is final. I would hate to see you waste what little money you have left chasing false hope. I'm only saying this because I still care about you. Be very careful." The message clicked off. Margaret sat perfectly still. She was not frightened. She was hyper-alert. Daniel had reacted far too fast. Simone hadn't called his lawyer. Ted had no reason to contact him, which meant someone on the witness list had warned him. She called Simone immediately. Simone listened to the recording twice. "Save that audio in 3 places. You think a voicemail matters?" Simone's voice was cold. "Arrogant men who feel legally safe don't leave threatening warnings this early in the game." Over the following days, Margaret called every name on the list. Willa Crenshaw, the retired bank closing assistant, remembered Aunt Clara vividly. "Your aunt asked me for certified copies of absolutely everything. The gift letter, the check receipt, the entire closing packet." Margaret looked down at the folder. Her aunt hadn't been guessing about Daniel's nature. She'd been preparing for war from day one. Beverly Ruiz, the old neighbor, remembered the yard work perfectly. "You were always outside covered in dirt with heavy tools." Daniel would come home in his suit and walk inside acting like the house had magically fixed itself. Beverly promised to find old block party photographs. By noon, the notebook was packed with names, dates, and an undeniable pattern of deception Daniel had never expected to face. Simone called back, sounding triumphant. "I spoke with Daniel's attorney. He laughed and called your claim emotionally unsupported. That was before you told him what we have." "Exactly. After I mentioned the notarized statement, the bank records, the cashier's check, and the witness list, his tone changed entirely." Simone sent the demand letter. It was beautifully, terrifyingly unemotional, naming every piece of evidence, then asking precise questions Daniel did not want placed on public paper. Why was Clara's gift hidden? Why were Margaret's expenses buried under his name? Why did he appear at a private, undisclosed cottage? That last question had its own story. The night after Margaret left the demand letter's details with Simone, bright headlights swept across the cottage wall. She froze. A vehicle was slowly climbing the gravel road. A black SUV, Daniel's. He stepped out into the dirt and looked around the clearing with the exact expression she recognized from open houses and closing tables. Not regret. Pure calculation. He was measuring the threat. Margaret stood beside the kitchen table in the dark, her hand resting on the green folder, and did not move. She did not step outside. She did not make herself smaller to ease his discomfort. After a long, tense minute, he got back in his SUV and drove down the mountain. Only then did she exhale. For 2 weeks, Daniel said nothing. Then his attorney requested a private settlement meeting. Simone called Margaret on a Thursday. They want this resolved quickly and quietly. Margaret looked out at the mountain mist. Quietly used to be exactly how he won. This time, Simone said, quiet doesn't mean empty. The meeting happened in Asheville, a large conference room with cold gray carpet and a table polished so brightly it reflected their hands. Daniel arrived in his Navy suit, carrying his careful posture. But his famous confidence no longer filled the room. His attorney spoke first, sweating slightly, calling the situation unfortunate and pleading that nobody wanted a painful public trial. Margaret listened. Simone listened. Then Simone opened the green folder. The temperature in the room dropped. Daniel stared at the papers the way a trapped man looks at a locked door. The first financial offer was insultingly low. Simone rejected it instantly. The second was better, but still not enough. Then Simone slid the photograph of Margaret in the unfinished Willowmere kitchen across the polished wood. On the back, this is the day she began making the house live again. Daniel stared at his young, exhausted wife in the photo. For once in his life, he had no ready sentence to spin the truth. Margaret finally spoke. Daniel, I am not sitting here because I want the old house back. He looked up, shocked. I love that house. I built the things that made it so valuable. You know that. I know that. And now, the legal record is going to know it too. You spent years letting me disappear. I am not asking you to become an honest man because it's noble. I'm demanding it because this proof means you no longer have a choice. No one moved. The final settlement came through 1 week later. It did not give Margaret her youth back, or the nights she worked while he collected the praise. But it did 3 vital things. It compensated her for the original family gift with interest. It compensated her for every documented drop of sweat equity she'd poured into Willowmere. And it forced one permanent, legally binding sentence into the public county record that Daniel Marsh could never erase. Margaret Whitfield made substantial, documented financial and physical contributions to the acquisition, massive restoration, and increased market value of the Willowmere Drive property. Margaret read that sentence 3 times, not because it healed all her wounds, but simply because it existed. Her name, her work, permanently on the record. Everyone expected her to take Willowmere Drive back. Margaret thought about it for a long time. Then one sunny afternoon, she drove slowly past the house. The tulip poplar was blooming. The porch looked perfect. A sharp pain rose in her chest, then settled. It wasn't gone, but it was no longer driving the car. Willowmere had been hers once, but it had ultimately become the place where she slowly disappeared. She did not want to spend her hard-won settlement fighting back into a cage that had taught her how to vanish. So she pressed the gas and kept driving. She drove all the way back up the mountain. Aunt Clara's cottage needed real work. Tin roof patching, sagging porch leveling, a stuck kitchen window. Margaret used her settlement money carefully. Not to make the cabin grand, but to make it livable, warm, strong, and undeniably hers. She sanded her aunt's table, but left the scars visible. She framed the green ink letter beside the window. She put the green folder in a fireproof box, no longer hidden, just protected. By winter she had heat. By spring she built a small design studio inside. People in the valley started calling her for design work. They didn't call Daniel. They called Margaret Whitfield. One morning, a year after she'd left the courtroom, Margaret stood in her mountain cottage holding a hot cup of coffee. Sunlight streamed across the exact floorboards where she had once knelt and found her salvation. White curtains moved softly in the mountain breeze. Firewood was stacked high by the door. Everything about the cottage looked profoundly, beautifully claimed. Daniel got to keep the physical house on Willowmere, but he did not get to keep the truth. He did not get to keep her name off the record. and he did not get to decide what her life was ultimately worth. Margaret never returned to the house that forgot her. Instead, she built a magnificent new life in the exact place that had remembered her first.